we look at the phenomena of big data, the one we discussed in the last lecture, and all we see are new technologies that are going to collect more data and analyze it more quickly. In the end, it looks like our current conceptions of privacy will be eroded, if not destroyed. So what are we going to do about it? In this lecture, I want to talk about where our privacy laws come from, how we got to where we are today, and what, if anything, we might think about as a way of changing the privacy laws without being complete Luddites about the new technology. So we're going to break this discussion into two parts. First, talking about the government's use of big data, and then talking about the private sector's commercial use of big data. And we'll end with a closely related topic, how big data analysis also can be used against the government itself, to keep it honest. So let's begin with what, to me, is pretty obvious, though I caution you that some people disagree with me. In my judgment, our current privacy rules are simply not up to the task. They are, to a very real degree, antique, relics of the last century. The relevant Supreme Court precedents date from the 1970s. Is it any wonder that the current structure of law does not match the technological reality? As we saw in the last lecture, the third-party doctrine was developed by the Supreme Court in two cases, United States versus Miller and Smith versus Maryland, back in the 1970s at the dawn of the computer era. It means that information you disclose to a third party is not protected by the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. In the context of data privacy, this means that there is no constitutional protection against the collection and aggregation of your cyber data, credit card purchases and the like, for purposes of data analysis and piercing the veil of anonymity. Now, there's some hope that this constitutional status quo might change. In January 2012, the Supreme Court considered a case by the title United States versus Jones. And full disclosure here, I did some work on Jones's side of the case. The case involved the decision by some federal agents to put a GPS tracking device on Jones's car. Do you remember the German politician we talked about in the last lecture? The one who produced a video of how his cell phone was tracked? The Global Positioning System, or GPS tracker, works in the same way, except it is a device that's independent of your phone. In this case, the agents attached the GPS tracker to Jones's car because they suspected he was a drug dealer. Sure enough, they tracked him to a drug stash house, and eventually he was convicted. But the agents had made a mistake. Maybe. They hadn't gotten a valid warrant to put the tracker on the car. Now, the government's argument was simple. Cars travel on public roads are exposed to the public, so Jones had no expectation of privacy in his travel, and therefore no warrant was needed. If you believe in the third-party doctrine, this was an easy case. But Jones won, 9-0. 5 justices thought that he should win on a very narrow and limited ground. That is, that in putting the GPS on his car, the federal agents had actually trespassed on his property, and that trespass required a warrant before they could do it. But 4 of the justices would have decided the case on a much broader ground. They would have said that the collection of large volumes of data, what we called the big data problem, raises constitutional issues because it allows the collection of enough data to create a mosaic picture. As we said in the last lecture, this mosaic allows us to piece together individual bits of data about Jones's life to develop a revealing picture of who he is. Now, to be sure, in this case, the picture indicated that he was a drug dealer. But in other cases, the technology might have been used to determine whether he was a Democrat or a Republican. Obviously, this type of rule would require some line drawing. How much data is enough to create an impermissibly large mosaic? Nobody knows. And the majority of the court didn't answer the question. But one thing we can say for sure is that the Supreme Court is thinking hard about how the standard Fourth Amendment analysis applies in the era of big data. For now, however, officially, the court and the Constitution are still on the sidelines. So all that's left to protect anonymity from government intrusion are the statutory protections created at the federal level by Congress. But those too are out of date. Our concepts of privacy are embedded in a set of principles known as the Fair Information Practice Principles, or FIPS, which were first developed in the United States in the early 1970s and have now become the keystone of the Privacy Act of 1974. In brief summary, which does not do them justice for want of detail, the principles say that a government should limit the collection of personal information to what is necessary. It should use it only for a specific and limited purpose, and be transparent and open with the public in how the information is collected and used. It should also allow the individual about whom the data is collected to see the data collected about him or her and correct it if necessary. I think you can probably see the problem already. The technology of big data collection and analysis just destroys these types of rules. A conscientious and fair application of these principles is in many ways fundamentally inconsistent with the way in which personal information is often used in the counterterrorism context, or, for that matter, in the context of commercial data analysis. Recognizing this fact is not, at this juncture, to make a normative judgment, but the truth is that the way in which data analysis programs function is at odds with these principles. The automated targeting system that discovered Raed al-Banya, that's the terrorist we discussed in the last lecture, who was turned away from O'Hare Airport and later bombed a market in Iraq. That simply can't work with these types of limitations. And consider, just as an example, the purpose and use specification principle, the one that says that data collected for one purpose should not be used for another. If fully applied, this idea would make it impossible for many sophisticated knowledge discovery systems to work well. Often the data that provides the missing link and makes a previously unknown connection is information that was collected for a different purpose and intended for a different use. To take the most prosaic example, recall our discussion in the last lecture about the 9/11 hijackers and how big data might have been used to foil their plot. Ordinarily, a phone number is collected from an air traveler when he books a flight for the purpose of allowing the airline to contact him, and his frequent flyer number is collected so that his loyalty account can be credited. The automated targeting system that we discussed in the last lecture uses those data fields for another purpose. That is, to identify potential connections between known terrorists and those who are otherwise unknown. It might have enabled us to spot the 9/11 plot before it was executed. But the way that system uses data is precisely what the purpose and use limitation principles forbid. In short, in this modern world of widely distributed networks with massive data storage capacity and computational capacity, so much analysis becomes possible that the old principles seem no longer to fit. What is needed then is a modernized conception of privacy, one with the flexibility to allow effective government action, but with the surety necessary to protect against governmental abuse. So, before we start this next part of the discussion, I have a confession to make. In most of this course, I've tried to present the facts and the information in a way that lets you decide what the right answer is. But today, we're moving into new terrain. A comprehensive new anonymity-protective legal structure doesn't exist and has yet to be developed. So any answer proposed is more in the nature of a proscription rather than a description. And opinions differ wildly on how we should move forward. Some people think that the old privacy rules should just be reinforced. I tend to think that's a mug's game and that technology is forcing change. So for the next few minutes, what I want to do is outline for you my own thoughts about a new way forward. In this view, the old idea of collection and purpose limitations yield because they can't withstand the new technology. Instead, we focus on how data is used. And more importantly, we refocus our laws so that our concern is not with use that is mere analysis, but rather with uses that constitute the imposition of an adverse consequence. So here are a couple of building blocks for this idea. First, we really need to dig deep into the idea of what we mean by privacy. Privacy is a misnomer in some respects. What it reflects is a desire for the independence of personal activity, a form of autonomy. We protect that privacy in many ways. Sometimes we do so through secrecy, which is effectively obscuring the observation of conduct and the identity of those engaging in the conduct. An example of this might be the voting booth, where who you are and what you do are both literally obscured behind a screen to create a secret environment. In other instances, we protect the autonomy directly, as for example when we talk about privacy rights in connection with freedom of religion or the right to marry whom you want. Indeed, the whole point of that kind of privacy is to allow people to act as they wish in public, which is a bit of an odd idea of privacy if you think about it. The concept of privacy that most applies to this new information technology regime and to the use of big data is the idea of anonymity. It's kind of a middle ground where observation is permitted, that is, we expose our actions in public, but where our identities and our intentions are not ordinarily subject to close scrutiny. The information data space is, as we've seen, suffused with information of this middle ground sort. Bank account transactions, phone records, airplane reservations, and smart card travel logs, to name but a few. They constitute the core of the transactions and electronic signature or verification information that's available in cyberspace. The type of anonymity that one has in respect of these transactions is not terribly different from real-world anonymity. Consider as an example the act of driving a car. It's done in public, but one is generally not subject to routine identification and scrutiny. So, protecting the anonymity we value requires, in the first instance, defining it accurately. We might posit that anonymity is, in effect, the ability to walk through the world unexamined. But that's not strictly accurate, for our conduct is examined numerous times every day. Sometimes the examination is by a private individual. For example, one may notice that the individual sitting next to them is wearing a wedding ring. Other routine examinations are by governmental authorities or commercial entities. The policeman in the car who watches the street, or the security camera that records us at the bank or the airport, for example. So what we really must mean by anonymity is not a pure form of privacy akin to secrecy. Rather, what we mean is that even though one's conduct is examined routinely and regularly, both with and without one's knowledge, nothing adverse should happen to you without good cause. In other words, the veil of anonymity, previously protected by the practical obscurity that we discussed in the last lecture, is now readily pierced by technology. So instead of relying on the lack of technical ability to protect privacy, the veil must be protected by rules that limit when piercing is allowed. These rules are needed to protect our privacy and to prevent governmental abuse. So to put it more precisely, the key to my conception of privacy is that privacy's principal virtue is as a limitation on consequence. If there are no unjustified consequences, that is, if the consequences that are the product of abuse or error or the application of an unwise policy are excluded, then under this vision, there's no real effect on a cognizable liberty or privacy interest. In effect, if nobody is there to hear the tree or identify the actor, it really does not make a sound. So, what's that mean? In the government context, the questions to be asked of a data analysis program are things like this. What is the consequence of identification? What's the trigger for that consequence? Who decides when the trigger is met? These questions are the ones that really matter. And questions of collection limitation or purpose limitation, for example, are, in my judgment, rightly seen as distractions from the main point. The right answers to these questions will vary, of course, depending on the context of the inquiry. But the critical first step is making sure that we're asking the right questions. So now we've got a working definition of modern privacy. How do we protect it and its essential component of anonymity? The traditional way is with a system of rules and a system of oversight for compliance with those rules. Here, too, modifications need to be made in light of technological change. Rules, for example, tend to be static and unchanging, and they don't account readily for changes in technology. Indeed, the Privacy Act, the central statute intended to protect individual privacy against government intrusion, is emblematic of this problem. The principles of the Privacy Act are ill-suited to most of the new technological methodologies. It was designed, for example, at a time when the only way we could imagine organizing data was based on the name of the person to whom it related. In modern databases, we can sort the data in any one of 1,000 different ways. Thus, we've begun to develop new systems and structures to replace these old privacy systems. First, we're changing from a top-down process of command and control rule to one in which the principal means of privacy protection is through institutional oversight. To that end, for example, the Department of Homeland Security was created with a statutorily required privacy officer and another officer for civil rights and civil liberties. The 2004 Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act and the implementing recommendations of the 9/11 Commission Act of 2007 have gone further. For the first time, they've created a civil liberties protection officer within the intelligence community. More generally, intelligence activities are to be overseen by an independent privacy and civil liberties oversight board. All of this is a good set of changes. These institutions serve a novel dual function. They are, in effect, internal watchdogs for privacy concerns. And in addition, they naturally serve as a focus for external complaints that require them to exercise some of the functions of an ombudsman. In either capacity, they are in a position to influence and change how the government approaches the privacy of its citizens. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, the very same systems that are used to advance our government's interests are equally well suited to ensure that government officials comply with the limitations imposed on them in respect of individual citizens' privacy. Put another way, the data analysis systems, what we sometimes call the data valence systems, or short for data surveillance, are uniquely well equipped to watch the watchers. And the first people who should lose their privacy are the officials who might wrongfully invade the privacy of others. Indeed, there are already indications that these sorts of strong audit mechanisms are effective. You may remember the incident in the 2008 presidential campaign in which contractors hacked into Barack Obama's passport file. In this instance, there was no lawful reason for the disclosure of the file. It was disclosed purely for prurient or political reasons. As a result, candidate Obama suffered an adverse consequence of disclosure, which had not met any legal trigger that would have permitted the disclosure. A strong audit function quickly identified the wrongdoers and allowed punitive action to be taken. They mostly lost their jobs. So, if we did these three things, reconfigured our conception of privacy, put the right control systems in place, and used a strong audit system for the government, we could be reasonably confident that a consequence-based system of privacy protection would move us towards a place where real legal protections could be maintained. It would not be perfect. There would always be mistakes and abuse. And it would be a lot more difficult to manage in the real world than the cut and dry, pure privacy protections we have in place now. But those protections are today more honored in the breach than in reality. We need a solution that is more in sync with today's technological realities, and what I've suggested should, I think, at least get us a little bit closer. So let's turn our focus from the government to the collection of private data by the commercial sector. Here we see a whole different set of challenges. On the one hand, the Constitution doesn't apply to private commercial actors, so that's not even a potential avenue for protecting privacy. On the other hand, the field is wide open for Congress to regulate in this area. Unlike government data mining, where the purpose is at least theoretically to protect national security, there is no urgent interest in commercial data mining. So when Congress steps in to limit it, the only negative consequence is that it upsets some settled commercial expectations. Now, I don't mean to diminish the costs involved with that kind of interference in the market. Far from it. In fact, at this point, the value of commercial use of big data has become so deeply embedded in the business model of cyberspace that it will be very difficult to modify. After all, why do you think that Facebook and Google and lots of other web-based services are free? You're getting something of pretty significant value from them, and for this part of the service, you're not paying a penny. That's one of the reasons why, if you think back to our economics and regulation lecture, it turned out that you were paying maybe 1/10 of what your personal utility value for internet access is. But of course, you're paying in another way, with information about you. Commercial companies value that information. It lets them know what to sell you or how to try and influence you. In a very real way, some web services are free to you precisely because the accumulation of your data is their product. Now, if we change that business model, and we can, then in the end, you'll have to pay for social media that is currently free. Here, however, we're already moving toward a system that looks more like my consequence idea of privacy. In order to protect your privacy and prevent the misuse of your data, you need to know what will happen to that data, and you need to be able to control the use of it. Slowly, the laws are moving that way. Increasingly, companies are being criticized for how they use your data, and they are changing what they do. Throughout the world, but especially in Europe, free web services are being called to account and told to publicize what they do, and to build in options that allow you to manage how your data is collected and used. It isn't pretty, and the commercial sector is resisting, but the trend is pretty clear. Meanwhile, here in the United States, we will almost certainly move in the near future to a do not track rule. Just like you can put yourself on a do not call list to avoid telemarketers, we may soon have a do not track list that you can sign up for that would prohibit anyone, except those you give permission to, from tracking your web traffic. Now, the truth is that do not call doesn't work perfectly. I know I still get too many junk calls, but it is better than the unregulated time before the law. And I expect that the same will be true of do not track when and if Congress and the executive branch get it up and running. Keep in mind, though, that any revision to existing privacy rules will face significant challenges. There is a growing connection between the commercial and political uses of your data, and politicians and political institutions may not want to see the privacy rules changed. For example, it is said that President Obama's 2012 re-election campaign had one of the largest and most effective databases ever, merging commercial data like your magazine subscriptions with your voting records to target individual voter preferences. If that kind of use of your data is effective, and the president was re-elected after all, How likely is Washington to ban it? So let me end this lecture looking at the subject of privacy from a different direction. This is, after all, a flip side to the loss of privacy. There are many in the world who see it as a gain in transparency. And this is especially so for governments. We're quickly coming to the point where governments won't be able to keep secrets very well, just like citizens are losing their privacy. One example from the last few years tells that story better than any analysis I could give you. Our case in point is a very macabre one, involving the death of a Hamas operative in Dubai. On January 19, 2010, Hamas commander Mahmoud al-Mabhouh, one of the founders of the group's military wing, was murdered in his hotel. Suspicion naturally fell immediately on Israel, since the government would be one of the few in the world with both a motive to kill al-Mabhouh and the means to do so. Suspicion soon became proof. The law enforcement authorities in Dubai were able to identify a hit squad with more than 20 members who were responsible for the killing, many of whom had traveled to Dubai on fraudulent passports. How they did it shows just how hard it is to keep secrets these days. To begin with, some of the team were spotted on security camera footage in the hotel, acting suspiciously. 2 were seen putting on disguises in the bathroom, and 2 others hung out in the lobby in tennis clothes for hours on end. But the hotel surveillance footage was just the beginning of the story. According to an Israeli investigative reporter, Ronen Bergman, the hit team apparently did not anticipate the ability of the Dubai authorities to piece together the bits of data from across disparate databases. For starters, the hit team's activities were tracked through a series of transactions using prepaid debit cards. The operatives all used the same type of card issued through Metabank in, of all places, Iowa. They were also connected through phone call records. The team members used phone numbers in Austria as relay stations to route calls amongst themselves. As Bergman puts it, quote, "Since dozens of calls were made to and from this short list of Austrian numbers over a period of less than 2 days, the moment that the cover of a single operative was blown and his cell phone records became available to the authorities, all others who called or received calls from the same number were at risk of being identified." Another piece of the puzzle was a trick that America had taught the Dubai authorities: the analysis of travel records. Dubai authorities searched their customs and immigration databases to identify anyone who entered and left Dubai shortly before and after the killing. They then cross-referenced this result against lists of visitors who were in Dubai during al-Mabhouh's previous visits to the United Arab Emirates. This created a target list of possible suspects, which could be matched against hotel registries. Video footage of check-in then matched faces to names. As a consequence, the Dubai authorities were able to compile a meticulous video record of the hit team from the Israeli intelligence service, the Mossad, both on the day of the murder and in their earlier visits to Dubai. Finally, the Dubai authorities published the passport photos of the suspects, leading in the end to a near certain identification. And of course, it isn't just the Mossad who has problems. All spy agencies do. The development of technology has made it very difficult, for example, for an undercover spy to move around with a covert false identity. Too many trails in cyberspace can now provide evidence that a false identity is a recent creation. The credit card was issued recently. The biometric data on the passport links to a person's true identity in another database somewhere. The claimed employment record can't be verified. All of these basic background facts are now subject to ready research on the network, making revelation of the falsity an increasingly easier task. We may well be reaching the point where human spying with a fictitious identity is a thing of the past, thanks to the internet. While governments might think that's a problem, some people, might think it's a good thing. If you want another example of this new transparency, think of this. I'm sure you remember how the U.S. Navy SEALs flew into Abbottabad and killed Osama bin Laden. Before they did that, they practiced on a mock-up of bin Laden's compound, constructed in secret. Well, maybe not so secret. It turns out that Bing Maps had a satellite picture of the facility in its storage. Someone eventually recognized it for what it was and made it public in October 2012, long after the actual facility had been destroyed and bin Laden killed. But what if the picture had been public before the raid? How you feel about transparency may depend upon whether you favor or oppose what it reveals. And even if you think that bin Laden is an easy case, you probably agree that there will be harder cases in the gray area. Big data, I think, is here to stay. And it will be a significant challenge to determine the right answers to many of the questions posed in this lecture. My vision is that we will have a different answer depending on the context, with different rules for, say, determining who can work at a nuclear facility from those that determine when we can deny someone the ability to board an airplane. Yet, these are the questions that must be answered. The improvements in computational power and data storage will not slow down, and we cannot expect to stop the deployment of new anonymity-invasive technology. I suspect that any effort to do so is doomed to failure before it's begun. So rather than vainly trying to stop progress or trying to fit the new technologies into old principles of privacy that no longer apply, we'll need to go about the business of answering the hard policy questions. Instead of reflexively opposing technological change, in my judgment, a wiser strategy is to accept the change and work within it to channel it in beneficial ways. This will require a rethinking of privacy, both a reconception of what we think it means and a reconfiguration of how we think it's to be protected. It may be true that privacy is dead, but for those who truly want to protect privacy, the motto should be, privacy is dead. Long live the new privacy. As communication technology moves to cyberspace, law enforcement and national security officials are becoming frustrated. The messages that travel through cyberspace are encrypted and broken up into packets, so they can't be intercepted. We call this the going dark problem, and it's serious enough that I'm going to devote this entire lecture to it, because our criminal and counterterrorism agents are losing the ability to listen in on the conversations of crooks, terrorists, and spies. Here's an example. In 2010, the government of India approached Research in Motion, RIM. They're the manufacturers of BlackBerry devices. They approached them with a demand. India wanted to monitor the encrypted emails and BlackBerry messages, which are a form of internet chat that passed across RIM's servers between corporate clients. And it wanted help in decrypting the encrypted messages. All of this was legal under Indian law, and it was, the Indian government argued, essential to allow it to combat terrorism. Finally, they added, if you don't give us this access, well then, we'll pull your wireless license and close down BlackBerry in India. Faced with the loss of more than 1 million Indian corporate customers, RIM compromised. It found a way to share with the Indian government where the encrypted messages the government wanted were, in effect, identifying the servers where the information originated without actually decrypting the messages themselves. In making this arrangement, RIM nicely illustrated two distinct yet linked issues that relate to the security of cyber communications and are deeply embedded in all aspects of cybersecurity. One is the issue of encryption. When and how communications and information can be encoded and decoded so that only the people you want to read the information can have access to it. The other is wiretapping. That is, whether and under what rules someone can intercept messages in transit and divert or copy them for their own purposes. The linkage between the two seems obvious. Wiretapping a message you cannot decrypt still leaves the content of the message concealed, and even unencrypted information is safe if the transmission channels are absolutely secure. Those who work in cybersecurity want both capabilities: to intercept or divert information and to decode it so that they can read its contents. And therein hangs our tale. India is not alone in its desire to read people's encrypted mail. Other governments, from Dubai and China to the United States, have the same interests, for good or for ill. Indeed, in late 2012, the United States government disclosed plans to expand its wiretapping laws to apply to encrypted email transmitters like BlackBerry, social networking websites like Facebook, and software that allows direct peer-to-peer messaging like Skype. Peer-to-peer messaging, by the way, means that you talk directly to someone else. There is no central switching point. Even Google has a central point where emails are stored, as former CIA Director David Petraeus found out to his regret when his correspondence with his mistress was uncovered in late 2012. But Skype and other peer-to-peer services do not. The United States considers this expansion in wiretapping important to combat espionage, crime, and war in cyberspace. But it may also be a harbinger of increased government intrusion into the communications of its private citizens. The idea behind encryption as a defensive mechanism is not, as we shall see, a perfect solution. But what it can do, if done properly, is ensure that your information is confidential and can't be read by anyone else. It also can, using modern algorithms, provide you with a means of confirming that the information has not been tampered with in any way. Encoding information can keep it secret and sealed. Properly used, it can also allow you to share information with a trusted partner while excluding others. But this expansion of cryptographic capabilities to protect cyber networks comes with an uncertain cost to order and governance. Advances in cryptographic technology have made it increasingly difficult for individuals to crack a code. Now, code breaking is as old as code making, of course. But as the run of technology has played out, encryption increasingly has an advantage over decryption. And recent advances have brought us to the point where decryption can, in some cases, be effectively impossible. This has the positive benefit of allowing legitimate users to protect their lawful secrets. But it also has the inevitable effect of distributing a technology that can protect malevolent uses of the internet. If the US government or Syrian activists can encrypt their data, so can China, or the Russian mob, or a Mexican drug cartel. An alternative strategy that works in concert with encryption is to make your information transmission immune to interception. Here, too, the changes wrought by internet technology have made interception more difficult and enhanced the security of communications. In the world of telephone communications, for example, intercepting a communication was as simple as attaching two alligator clips to the right wire. That's where we get the word wiretapping from. Communications through the internet are, you'll remember, wholly different. The information being transmitted is broken up into small packets that are separately transmitted along different routes and then reassembled when they arrive at their destination. This disassembly of the data makes effective interception appreciably more difficult. So these two technological developments have led to controversy over critical policy issues that bear on cybersecurity today. Can, for example, a government require the manufacturers of encryption technology to limit their distribution to prevent strong cryptography from falling into malevolent hands? And can they require communications transmission companies to ensure that the government has access to those communications? Can they, in effect, require that code makers build in a backdoor by which they can access and decrypt encoded messages? And can they require Internet service providers, ISPs, to provide them access to the data as it transits the net? And if they can, under what rules would these backdoors be accessed? At the whim of a government? Or only with an appropriate court order? Under what sorts of standards? Encryption, or secret writing, is one of the oldest forms of human activity. Secret coding has been around almost as long as there have been secrets worth keeping. One of the earliest instances is recorded in the Histories by Herodotus, who described how secret writing techniques saved the Greeks from being conquered by Xerxes, the king of Persia. A Greek, witnessing the buildup of the Persian fleet, sent a message to Sparta warning of Xerxes' plans. To keep the message from being intercepted, he concealed the writing beneath the wax covering of a wood tablet. Forewarned and prepared, the Greeks were able to assemble their navy and to defeat the Persian fleet at the Battle of Salamis. Conceptually, encryption involves three separate components that come together: the plain text, the algorithm, and the key. Now, the plain text is the substance of the message that the sender wants to convey. Of course, this information doesn't have to be a text at all. It can be the numerical firing code for a nuclear missile, or the formula for Coca-Cola products, or quite literally any data of any form that is more valuable to the sender if not known by someone else. The algorithm is a general system of encryption. In other words, a general set of rules for transforming a plain text. An example of an algorithm is a cipher, where, say, each letter of the plain text, and let's assume it's actually a written text, is replaced with another letter. The algorithm here is replace each letter with another. The third and most vital component of an encryption system is the key. That is the specific set of instructions that will be used to apply the algorithm to a particular message. A cipher key might therefore be replace the original letter with the letter which is 5 letters after it in the English alphabet. Using that simple algorithm and key, the plain text cat would then be converted to the word HFY, and that result would now be known as the ciphertext. The critical feature, of course, is that, as an initial premise at least, only someone who has the algorithm and the key can decrypt the ciphertext. So even if the text is physically intercepted, the contents remain confidential. Now, we've been creating ciphertexts for quite a long time. Earliest mentions of coded writing can be found in the Kama Sutra, which counsel women to record their liaisons in secret writing. Julius Caesar's use of codes was so common that the type of algorithm he used, the very letter shift system we just talked about, is actually sometimes called the Caesar shift cipher. Of course, where some seek to keep secrets, others seek to reveal them. It is one of the truisms of encryption that the key to keeping a secret is the key, not the algorithm. The algorithm, the general method, is often too widely known to be usefully kept secret. So the strength of the key, how hard it is to guess, defines how good the encryption product is. Let's return to the Caesar shift cipher. If we restrict ourselves to just shifting letters of the alphabet, there are only 25 possible keys to use, depending upon how far down the alphabet we shift the letters. Now, that's a pretty weak key. If someone knows the general algorithm, the key can be cracked with brute force in a short period of time. That means all they have to do is try each of the 25 possible keys, and eventually one of them will work. Now, if we loosen the algorithm a bit, however, and instead of a shift rule, apply a rule that allows any rearrangement of the 26 letters of the English alphabet, then the number of keys increases astronomically to well over 400 septillion possible arrangements. That's a 4 followed by 24 zeros. That makes a brute force effort to discover the key by trying every possible one difficult indeed. But brute force is not the only method of breaking a cipher. Since at least the 9th century, when the method was first reported by Arab scholars, it has been well established that a cipher can be broken by frequency analysis rather than brute force. Frequency analysis is relatively simple to describe. It rests on the knowledge that, for example, in English, the letter E is the most common vowel. Other common letters in regular usage include A, I, N, O, and T. Now, with this knowledge, derived from analysis that's external to the code, the deciphering of a ciphertext is made much easier. It is far more likely than not that the most frequently used cipher letter, whatever it may be, represents one of these common English letters. In a ciphertext of any reasonable length, there is virtually no chance, for example, that the most common cipher letter is being used to signify a Q or a Z. This sort of knowledge makes decryption easier and reduces the need for a brute force approach. Indeed, it's a fair assessment of the art of cryptography that until the dawn of the computer era, those decrypting ciphers had the upper hand. Either the keys themselves could be stolen, or they could be decrypted using sophisticated techniques like frequency analysis. Even the notoriously difficult German Enigma code from World War II eventually yielded to frequency analysis. That code was used to send orders to German U-boats, and it was eventually cracked by the English cryptographers at Bletchley Park. There things stood for a number of years. Those who wanted to keep secrets were at a fundamental disadvantage. In order to transmit a secret message, they first had to exchange a secret key to the message. Besides the possibilities of backwards analysis to determine what the key was, there were all sorts of problems with the exchange of keys in the first instance. They could be lost, stolen, revealed, or compromised in any number of ways. By their very nature, private keys were only good for as long as they were private. In the late 1970s, however, enterprising cryptographers developed a way to encrypt information using the multiplication of two extremely large prime numbers and certain one-way mathematical functions. Most mathematical functions, like addition and subtraction, work in both directions. You can get the results from the precursors or the precursors from the results, so to speak. A one-way function is one that only works in one direction. Here's the best analogy I can give you. You can get a nice omelet from eggs, but you can't get unbroken eggs from an omelet. Some math functions work like that too, only in one direction. Now, with one-way functions, someone who wants to receive encrypted